Cudner Hyatt house is one of the last remaining farmhouses in this part of Westchester County. This farmhouse was lived in for over 200 years by only two families, the Cudners and the Hyatts. Micaiah Cudner was a farmer who had been born in Mamaroneck to a father who was a weaver. Somewhere between 1723 and 1740, he bought this property from Peter Ferris. He had another farmhouse in Eastchester where he lived with his wife and 7 children. He eventually had 2 of his sons, Elijah and Reuben, farm this land for him while he continued to acquire more and more. By the time he died, he had 281 acres. Both boys, young men, were very active in Scarsdale affairs and lived in this house. During the American Revolution, Scarsdale people were very divided. There were many, many people in Scarsdale who were loyal to the king. However, the Cudner family were not. Reuben joined the American forces, and also his brother Elijah married the daughter of Samuel Crawford, who was Scarsdale's first patriot who was killed in the Revolutionary War. After their father died, Reuben inherited the house, and they lived here until 1836, when the last Cudner died. The house was put up for auction, and it was bought by Caleb Hyatt for $2,990. And 4 generations lived in the house until 1972, when Caleb Hyatt and his wife Elvira died in the house in the spring of that year within 1 month of each other. We're standing now in the graveyard of St. James the Less in Scarsdale, New York. This area of the cemetery in 3 tiers here is the burial ground of 3 generations of the Hyatt family. This is the first generations of Hyatts who lived in the house. This is Caleb Hyatt, his wife Sarah, their 2 little boys who died very young, only about a month apart. Their son Elijah, who lived until 1910, and their daughter Sarah Hyatt, who never married and died in 1934. Oliver Hyatt was a vestryman here at this church for 63 years, the longest time that any person ever had that position. The house was sold by their estate to a developer, a person who was going to put many houses on his property. The outcry in the village of Scarsdale was very, very loud, and a group of citizens got together and raised some money, got the down payment for this house. The citizens who bought this house decided that we had to have an historical society. So the Historical Society was founded, and its first president, Mrs. Ida Newhouse, was the one who devised, along with her first vice president, Betty Greenebaum, the idea that we should be a part of the New York State education system. And so we took on a mandate of using this house to educate the children of Scarsdale about its local history, and it was open to all children from all over Westchester County. Its plan was to use this house as a museum and to be used as an educational tool to teach the history of Scarsdale. Restoring the Cudner Hyatt house and turning it into a museum was no small task. It involved many historical restoration consultants, contractors, and volunteers. In 1977, an 1828 Quaker meeting house on the Manichurian family property at Griffin and Weaver Streets was donated to the society. It was dismantled and reassembled next to the Cudner Hyatt house. It became the offices of the Scarsdale Historical Society and hosted many exhibitions. As you know, the house is built on the White Plains Post Road in Scarsdale. It's significant in that this road is 5,000 years old. It was a trail that was well beaten down by all the Native Americans, and it started in New York City, and it went all the way to Canada. But all of the early houses in Scarsdale were built right here on this street. In 1960, Oliver's son Caleb drew a sketch of how he remembered the farm when he was 10 years old. In 1890, the farm stretched from the Bronx River across the railroad tracks to the post road. Their crops included corn and potatoes. There were acres of cherry and apple orchards. Buildings included a smokehouse, a chicken house, a hog house, a horse barn, a cider mill, and a silo. They also had cows and oxen. This is a model of the Cudner Hyatt house that was made actually by Oliver many, many years later, but it's good to show you how this all worked. This was the original Cudner house here, except that it didn't go quite that far. It only went to that side of the front door. When Caleb bought the house, he waited about 3 years, and then he raised the roof, put a second story on, and enlarged the living room, which had only been in 12 feet into the house, and made it a much larger room. At some point, he took a very early pre-revolutionary building that was on the grounds and attached it onto the house. It faces south, as all early houses did, to catch an extra hour daylight. And this became their kitchen and their boarding room, and eventually that became a buttery. The interior of the museum would be restored to reflect a 50-year time period from 1836 to 1886. These were the years that Sarah Odell Hyatt lived in the house with her family until her death. Each room tells a story. Over the years, we had little yellow buses coming from all over Westchester County, and the children pouring out to learn what it was like to live in a farmhouse like this. We're standing in the restored kitchen of the pre-revolutionary house that was attached on. Initially, the first Sarah Odell would have used this fireplace that's behind the stove. The stove would have been a later addition. Our classes loved this stove. Another thing that fascinated the children, definitely, was the water situation in this house. Initially, the first Sarah had to walk down almost a mile to the Bronx River and carry her water back up the hill. She was a very happy lady when her husband finally dug a well for her. This is how she got her water. She pumped it, and it came from the well in the backyard. This is the boarding room, which actually we now call the buttery, because it was behind the original fireplace. This was where babies were kept warm until they could go to a different room. All of these implements have a cutoff date of 1886. However, the most interesting ones are the newer ones, probably from the 1870s on. When ladies wore those lovely lace collars and everything, this is a crimper where you actually put your collar through this process and it came out all beautifully ironed for you. Of course, this, which weighs an absolute ton, is what this poor housewife had to do. Some of the things are quite fascinating. This is an old wash tub. Imagine you brought the water in from the tub and then you put your stuff in, your soap, which was usually a big yellow bar like that that smelled perfectly horrible, and then you used this to wash your clothes. Children were barefoot all summer long. Their grandmothers or their mothers knitted their socks for them, and they were always made of wool. And these stretchers were used to put them back in their original shape, because if you've ever had wool, you know that you have to stretch it in order to keep it where it belongs. Of interest is these. And when the children came to visit the house, since our mandate was education, this was one of their favorite things to do. We used to put rugs, actual small rugs, outside and let the children beat them. And the boys absolutely adored it. This room we have restored for museum purposes as a Victorian dining room. The wallpaper and the woven carpets were chosen by experts. We had so many consultants that came from all over, and this reflects their wonderful ideas. Now, the grandmother, who is Sarah, who came here as a bride, died in this house, in this room. We call this the grandmother's room, and we have restored it as such. She knitted her family, their socks here, and this was her sewing machine, which was a treadle machine and made all the family clothes. This print on the wall actually is 1873 of a grandmother and her granddaughter together. This is a rope bed, and that's in a log cabin quilt. But you see, it's very lumpy because there are all ropes underneath here, and that's holding it in place. No such thing as box springs in those days. And the expression sleep tight means that your ropes were tight. This is wallpaper that we found underneath tons and tons of paint and other wallpapers, and this is the original, which is why we have it there under plexiglass. This living room has been restored to about Civil War time. Wallpaper, the Eastlake furniture, and the carpeting certainly reflect Victorian times. Many middle-class families, even farming families, were able to afford one of these Rogers statues. This one is named Weighing of the Baby. Over here we have this absolutely beautiful restored pump organ. We often had Christmas parties here, and we had even choristers that came and sang in Victorian costumes, and it was really quite a beautiful room when it was decorated for Christmas time. This was left purposely open so that the children could see how the house was framed. This is the parents' bedroom, and we see yet another kind of stove. This is obviously a Franklin stove, but this is not wood as was the children's room. This was coal, and this is a coal scuttle. And there is your coal. This doll made of china was something that all of the school children loved, because they couldn't believe that any doll could have a face that was all hand painted like that. I have been fascinated by these because my own grandmother, who taught in a one-room schoolhouse in North Colebrook, Connecticut in Civil War time, wore these in her hair. These are tortoiseshell clips which actually held your bun in place. This is Monkey brand black toothpaste for your husband if he had a mustache. Very beautiful. Silver handle on bone. I think one of the best things about this room is this beautiful sewing machine, because it's a step up by about 40 years from the one that we saw downstairs. This ironwork is much superior to the other and it reflects Victorian times, but this, I could probably sew, or you could sew on this machine today. These beautiful things, they were all made by hand in tiny little fairy stitches. Grandmas were very good at this because they had the time. The mothers were very busy carrying coal scuttles and all that other paraphernalia that they had to deal with every day. You know, I can imagine that Sarah made these beautiful night clothes. This was always a wonderful thing to teach children how clothes came into being. Here is the mother's nightgown, of course the hand-done quilt, and this is for the fathers. And they would say, oh, come on, a man never wore anything like that. For museum purposes and for the school children who came through this house so many times, we restored this as a children's room. The boys' clothing always fascinates the little boys who visit this house, because these are just absolutely, these are not reproductions, these are all originals. They all wanted to use the hoops. We always love to show the rope beds. This, as you can see, is on the outside of the bed. However, this one is inside the bed. I don't have to tell you what this is. It's a child's potty chair. And the school children who came here were always intrigued by, that was often one of the chores that the children of the 19th century had, was to empty all the pots and to clean them out and bring them back to the rooms again, especially the oldest sons. And this is a marble game. Always fascinated all the kids. This is a picture of Oliver Hyatt, who was to marry the girl across the road and bring a third Sarah into the house. This was taken when he was in his 20s. He was the father of 5 boys. 2 of the boys died very young, only a month apart, of an illness. We're not sure exactly what it was. And it was very shortly after that that their mother, Sarah, lost both her mother and her father the same day. They lived across the street and they had a marble quarry. They also raised prize horses. And they had a young horse named Starlight who had a star on his forehead. They were breaking him in with their surrey. And they were driving down Harney Road, which was their road actually, and a train came. And Starlight made it across, but the parents did not. They're buried in a double grave at St. James the Less Church. The coming of the railroad would transform this country, and Scarsdale was no exception. Caleb had bought some land from a neighbor, adding 42 acres onto the original 62 that he already came with the house. His deed included the right to give land to the railroad when it arrived in Scarsdale in 1844. The farm was beginning to be broke up after the grandmother's death because this was beginning to be a suburban town. They sold off several parcels of the land down in the village, although they retained this part up by the post road. As the days of farming came to an end, Oliver and his son Caleb looked to the future. They became surveyors and engineers. Oliver would map and oversee the paving of many roads in Scarsdale. Knowing the story of the 2 families who lived in this house for over 2 centuries not only deepens our understanding of Scarsdale history, but that of our nation's history.